Archaeologists in Israel have just discovered 4 amazingly preserved Roman-era swords. Let's have a look at the story. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this news story just hit some of the news networks today, and there's some brilliant material coming out of this. These are 4 amazingly preserved Roman-era swords, supposedly associated with a Jewish revolt around the year 100 AD. And we're going to look at these swords here because I am a sword expert. If you don't know me, I'm a former archaeologist, current antique sword dealer, and I also study things in museums, make replicas of them, work with various different sword manufacturers, and I teach swordsmanship and look at historical treatises talking about that. So, regular viewers will know all of that about me. If you're new to the channel, please remember to subscribe, the button's down there, or if you find that you've watched a few of my videos and you're not subscribed yet, please do. So this is an amazing story. First of all, a bit of context. The fact is that Roman swords don't just turn up every day. There are not a huge number of surviving Roman swords in the entire world. So when you find 4 in one go, that's major news. And in some senses, it's even more major news when these are swords found in Israel and potentially associated, we'll come back to this, but potentially associated with a Jewish revolt, a war essentially between the rebellious people of Judea and the Romans, their Roman overlords at that time. So let's look and see what the article, which I'll link below if you want to watch the original video yourself, the link's down below, but let's see what they say in this news piece.
אנחנו מדברים על ממצא נדיר ביותר, כמותו לא נתגלה בארץ ישראל.
So it's really important to state how rare this is. I'm not aware of 4 Roman swords ever being found in anything even like this kind of situation. Obviously we find Roman swords at places like Pompeii, and there have been various other famous Roman sites where you found Roman swords, but they've never been found in what seems like a random cave in Israel. So, and also there's the state of preservation. So for anybody who doesn't know, usually what you either find is the organic material, that is parts of the hilt or the scabbard, or you find the iron or steel blade. You don't normally find both, and that's because there's, as an archaeologist I can tell you that the methods of preservation of materials mean that usually it either favours organic materials or it favours metals. And obviously, you know, iron and steel rusts away, wood rots away, and various little creatures eat those things and destroy them, and moisture destroys them through oxidization and everything else. So to get iron or steel blades and organic material hilts, and in this case the scabbards, and things wrapped around them as well, is just absolutely extraordinary. And I can only assume that this is a result of essentially a lack of moisture and a very desiccated and dry and arid environment preserving these things, and meaning that the creatures and moisture and things which normally break down these materials just weren't present. Now what's also extraordinary about finding 4 swords together like this is that they're not identical, they're not one set, they don't even appear to be from one specific source maybe. There are 4 different swords and they have all got notable, very visually easy to see differences between them. Generally speaking, I would describe, I've seen these described as Sparta, 3 of them anyway, and one of them described as a gladius. Now in my opinion they are all gladius, or gladii plural. They're all swords anyway, so whether we use the word Sparta or gladius, the fact is that these are Roman type swords, which doesn't mean they were Roman. There's a lot of assumption going on here saying that they are Roman swords. I think that that's not necessarily definitely the case, but what's great is they are 4 different types rather than being sort of, you know, like regimental carbon copies of each other. Now as you can see, the next amazing thing to note is that, as mentioned, they have the blades, they have the scabbards, they have the hilts, all parts of the hilt, that is the guard, the grip, the pommel, and some of them at least, or possibly all of them originally, have some kind of covering. It looks like they were wrapped in something. I'm not sure whether that's fabric or whether it's leather, but anyway, they are wrapped and encased in something which probably protected them from moisture for quite a lot of that time. And they were probably wrapped up and secreted in some kind of bundle for some reason we don't exactly know. Now looking at the construction here, it's very, very interesting. So the blades, as far as I can see, split into 2 main types. They split into the Mainz type gladius and the Pompeii type gladius. Now the Mainz type gladius is earlier than the Pompei Gladius, but they overlap. So the fact that we've got 4 swords here and we have both Mainz and Pompei suggests to me that this is an overlap period. Now, these have been dated so far to the 100s AD, associated with a particular set of Jewish revolts against Roman rule. However, potentially these swords could be a problem with that, because the Mainz Gladius is around before Christ and then into the 1st century, that is between 1 and 101 AD. So theoretically that should be an earlier sword. The Pompei Gladius is around from around Christ's time. So they overlap around this time. So in the time of Jesus, for example, you would have found Mainz and Pompei Gladius's swords in this time being used by the Romans. So the fact that we've got both types here could mean one of 2 things, in my opinion. One is either these swords are slightly earlier dated than the archaeologists are here saying, or they're old swords, and that's always possible, of course. You have to remember, just because something was made, let's say, in 20 AD, doesn't mean that it's still not being used in 120 AD. It could still be. Although I have to say, I think the chances diminish the further you go on. And I would say that once we get into the 100s, that is really quite late for a Mainz Gladius to still be in use. So it could be an old weapon, it might not be. The other thing to mention is the quality of manufacture. So I've looked at quite a lot of Roman sword parts over the years. I've been a volunteer working at the Museum of London back when I was an archaeology student. I've studied gladius sword parts at places like the Royal Armouries and the British Museum and the Museum of London, as mentioned, and various other places, and I've seen many in books and photographs from various studies and journals and such like. In my opinion, these swords, with the exception of the ring-pommelled one, and we'll come back to that, with the exception of the ring-pommelled one, the standard gladii or gladius shown here is fairly crude. Both the guard, the grip, I'll come back to the grip, and what we can see of the pommels appear to be very, very basic. And I'm not sure that these would have been accepted by the Roman military. I'm not sure that these are necessarily Roman military swords. Now, we have to bear in mind that in the time of the Roman occupation of this area, there were other people making swords and other people carrying swords. Even in the Bible we see and read of people carrying swords who aren't in the Roman military. So I actually wonder if these are locally made swords and not necessarily Roman. They might even be Roman blades with locally made hilts in the Roman style, because of course where the Romans ruled, they also brought their clothes, their dress sense, the style of pottery, their style of amphora, and you know, everything really, their culture, their material culture with them. And this is true of swords and weapons. The fact is that helmets and swords and shields, Roman styles influenced other areas like Gaul or Britain or indeed Judea. So I think it's possible from the quality of manufacture of these that these aren't necessarily Roman military weapons. They may be Jewish made weapons, potentially using imported Roman blades or maybe locally made blades. Now, specifically the grips I said I'd come back to, it's quite traditional and normal with Roman military swords to have a grip very often made of bone and very often octagonal or ribbed. And we don't see that here. Okay, these are wooden grips. We do sometimes find wooden grips on Roman military swords, but they're usually quite carefully shaped. And in fact, there's examples found in London. And you've got to remember, London at this time is fairly much an outreach of, you know, it's a far out on the borders of the Roman Empire. And yet from London, Roman Londinium, we have these sword grips surviving. And they are usually of bone, sometimes of wood, and they are ribbed and often octagonal. These grips appear very crude, very basic. They don't look like they're ribbed, they don't look like they're octagonal. They look like a basic copy of a Roman sword, kind of an impressionistic sense of them. So again, I don't think that the grips specifically necessarily show Roman manufacture. Additionally, if we look at the pommel peening, so 2 of these swords, we can actually see how they're peened at the end. One seems to just be peened onto a wooden pommel, which is really quite odd. Normally you have to Peen is rivet, and usually when you rivet down the end of a tang, you need something hard to rivet onto, so you need some type of washer. Now the other sword does have a washer. It could be that the one which doesn't have a washer, the washer fell off, or I don't know. Maybe they found some other way of peening it without hammering into the wood. But the one which has a washer, the washer is very square and has rather, should we say, jagged or pointed out corners which haven't been shaped, they haven't been rounded, they haven't been pushed down, and it's crude. It's very crude manufacture, and it doesn't tally with what I know of Roman military swords. So again, I think that these are probably not Roman military swords. I think they're probably locally produced copies of Roman military swords. However, I want to state once again that if we come back and look at the blades, particularly that point of that Pompey gladius, which I'm looking at now, it looks very precise, it looks very straight and well formed. They're still sharp apparently, which I guess they would be, wouldn't they, if they haven't rusted. And it could be that the blades are Roman, so it could be that they're Roman imported blades that have been re-hilted. Maybe the blades, and maybe that's why we find a Mainz gladius blade, maybe the blades have been in use for decades by this point, and they've had various replacement hilts put on them. That's always a possibility. Now I'd also mention the scabbards as well. We know quite a lot about Roman military scabbards, because a lot of them survive, at least parts of them survive. The British Museum, for example, has some beautiful parts of a Roman military scabbard. And Roman military scabbards, particularly at this time, 2nd century, or if it's 1st century, Roman military scabbards are of very specific types and have a lot of metal fittings on them, usually made of copper alloy, so brass or bronze, and they have rings, mounting rings, they have a chape, they have edging around the side. They're very reinforced. They're not just two slabs of wood wrapped in leather or anything like that. They are wood, then they're leather, then they're brass fittings, sometimes steel fittings on top as well. So they're very complex and very difficult to reproduce, incidentally, or at least accurately, things. These don't look like Roman military scabbards at all. So again, this gives credence to the idea, my theory anyway, that these aren't Roman military swords, at least not directly. These are swords being used by locals, perhaps being produced by locals, or maybe using imported blades, and then the rest of the scabbards and the hilts are made by locals. Now I said I'd come back to that ring-pommelled sword. Now this is a very unusual and characteristic type. There are parallels for this in archaeology. There are other ring-pommelled Roman swords. In my opinion, these hilt parts are Roman. So I think this is an example of a Roman sword. It's actually quite different to the others in construction, and we would also therefore say it's probably a slightly different date and from a different place. These aren't four swords that have been captured from one group of Romans, because they don't match each other. The fact is that Roman soldiers, particularly in one particular legion or regiment, they would have the same equipment. If you had 100 Roman soldiers and you fought a battle against them and you defeated them, then you would end up with a set of equipment, whether it's helmets or shields or pila or swords, that look alike, because everyone would have had similar looking equipment within that group of people. Equally, if you raided a Roman settlement and you raided an armory, in an uprising, in a revolt, then the armory would have contained more or less a set of similar looking equipment. These are four dissimilar. You could say two of the swords are quite similar, but two of the others are completely dissimilar. So they don't match. So I think these have been acquired through different means at different times. They may have been, obviously have been secreted at the same time, but I don't think they've been gathered at the same time through one particular uprising or one particular part of the uprising or one particular battle or whatever. Now this ring pommel sword, you can see the quality of the fittings is higher. It's also a smaller sword. I think that this is a Roman sword, and I don't think this is a replacement hilt. I think this is Roman, but that doesn't mean that all the rest are necessarily. So there you go. I don't want to undermine this at all. It's absolutely wonderful to find four swords all together of this era in this area. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think it actually creates more questions than answers. And I also think that we shouldn't make any assumptions at this point. I don't think that these four swords are necessarily from the same place or even the same time. They were obviously deposited at the same time, but I don't think they were gathered necessarily. And three of them, at least, I don't think are necessarily Roman, or at least I don't think necessarily the hilts and the scabbards are Roman, even if the blades are Roman. So we shouldn't assume that these were Roman swords taken from Romans and hidden by Jewish rebels. They could very likely have just been Jewish swords, which actually, given that they were found in Israel, is in some ways even more significant because I think that those hilts and scabbards could be entirely indigenous local manufacture, even if they're in a Roman style. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. Check out the original video below. There's various other articles you can find on various news sources at the moment. Please subscribe if you haven't done already, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.